The bright morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 at the Franklin County Municipal Court. Sarah Jenkins adjusted her navy blue blazer as she sat on the hard wooden bench, waiting for her case to be called. At 42 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her shoulders straight and her dark eyes alert, watching as other cases moved through the system with mechanical efficiency. The courthouse was unusually busy that Monday morning. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, barely masking the whispered conversations and shuffling papers that filled the room. Sarah checked her watch again, 9:45 a.m. She had already been waiting for 2 hours, but her military training had taught her patience. Case number 2024 TR 1458, Sarah Jenkins, the court clerk finally called out, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah stood up smoothly, gathering her documents in her well-organized folder. As she walked to the defendant's table, she could feel Judge Michael Richardson's eyes following her movement. The judge, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had been serving on the bench for over 2 decades. His reputation for being strict was well known throughout the county. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Richardson began, his voice carrying a hint of impatience, "you're here today for running a red light at the intersection of Main and 4th Street on March 15th. How do you plead?" Sarah stood tall behind the wooden podium. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge being at that intersection, I would like to explain the circumstances." "A simple guilty or not guilty will suffice." Judge Richardson cut her off, looking down at her file without making eye contact. The few spectators in the courtroom could sense the tension building. The judge's dismissive tone was hard to miss, and a few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah noticed the bailiff shifting his weight from one foot to the other, something she had learned to recognize as a sign of discomfort during her years of reading people's body language. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady and clear. Judge Richardson finally looked up, his blue eyes cold as they met Sarah's. He seemed to take in her appearance for the first time, her perfectly pressed clothes, her neat cornrows pulled back in a professional style, and her straight posture. But instead of seeing these as signs of discipline and respect, his expression suggested he had already made assumptions about her. "Ms. Jenkins, the officer's report clearly states that you went through the light 3 seconds after it turned red. The intersection cameras confirmed this. Are you suggesting that both the officer and the camera are incorrect?" Sarah opened her folder. "Your Honor, if I may explain." "Ms. Jenkins," the judge interrupted again, his voice growing harder, "this court's time is valuable. The evidence is clear. You ran a red light, putting others at risk. This is your 3rd traffic violation this year." Sarah's hand tightened slightly on her folder, but her face remained composed. The previous violations had been minor, a parking ticket when her meter expired during a veterans support meeting, and a disputed turn signal incident that she was still contesting. The judge shuffled some papers on his bench, barely glancing at them. "Given your record and the clear evidence in this case, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500 plus court costs. This should serve as a reminder to follow traffic laws more carefully." The sentence fell heavy in the quiet courtroom. A few observers shook their heads, recognizing the unusual harshness of the fine for a first-time red light violation. But Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly reached into her folder and pulled out several documents. "Your Honor," she began, her voice still respectful but carrying a new weight of authority, "I believe there are some important details about this case that you need to see." As she spoke, her military ID card became visible among the papers in her hand. The fluorescent lights caught the holographic seal of the United States Air Force, creating a small rainbow that danced across its surface. Judge Richardson's eyes flickered to the ID, and for the first time that morning, his expression began to change. The story that was about to unfold would shake not only his assumptions but the entire courthouse's understanding of justice and prejudice. But for now, Sarah Jenkins stood quietly, holding the documents that would change everything, waiting for the judge to realize his first mistake of the day. The military ID card in Sarah's hand seemed to change the whole feeling in the courtroom. Judge Richardson's eyes moved from the card to the stack of papers Sarah was holding. His face showed surprise, but he tried to hide it quickly. "These papers, Your Honor," Sarah said calmly, "include my service record and a letter from the Veterans Affairs Office about what happened on March 15th. She pulled out a thick folder filled with official documents. The judge frowned. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. Ms. Jenkins, I've already made my decision about the fine, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. Sarah stood her ground. Your Honor, I served 15 years in the United States Air Force. On March 15th, I was responding to an emergency call from one of my fellow veterans who was having a crisis. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone was watching this unexpected turn of events. Even the court clerk had stopped shuffling papers to listen. I was working at the Veterans Support Center, Sarah continued, when I got a call from James Wilson, a Marine veteran who was having thoughts of hurting himself. Her voice was steady, but everyone could hear the seriousness in her words. Judge Richardson's face changed again. He looked down at his papers, then back at Sarah. And this Mr. Wilson, he called you specifically. Yes, Your Honor, I'm his assigned support coordinator. I have the call log here, showing the exact time, 2:47 p.m. The traffic camera caught me at the red light at 2:52 p.m. I was trying to reach him before. Sarah paused for a moment. Before he did something he couldn't take back. The judge looked uncomfortable now. He shifted in his big chair and adjusted his glasses. Some people in the courtroom were nodding, understanding why someone might run a red light in such a situation. And Mr. Wilson, the judge asked, his voice much softer now. What happened to him? Sarah pulled out another paper. He's alive, Your Honor. I got to him in time. This is a letter from the VA hospital confirming his admission that day and thanking me for my quick response. She handed the paper to the court officer who brought it to the judge. Judge Richardson read the letter slowly. The courtroom stayed quiet, but now it was a different kind of quiet. Not the tense silence from before, but a quiet full of respect and understanding. Ms. Jenkins, the judge said, clearing his throat, why didn't you mention this at the beginning of the hearing? I tried, Your Honor. Sarah replied respectfully, but you said you only wanted a guilty or not guilty plea. Several people in the audience nodded. They had all heard the judge cut her off earlier. Even the bailiff, who usually kept a straight face, gave a small nod. Sarah then pulled out more papers. I also have here my service records showing my work in Afghanistan, where I helped coordinate emergency response teams. And these are letters from other veterans I work with now, explaining how our quick response system saves lives. Judge Richardson looked at the growing pile of evidence on his desk. His face was getting redder by the minute. He picked up Sarah's military ID again, looking more carefully this time at the decorations and ranks listed. I see here you were a strategic operations commander, he said, his voice now full of respect. That's quite impressive. Yes, Your Honor. And I used those same skills on March 15th to handle an emergency situation. I know running the red light was wrong, but I made a split-second decision to save a life. The judge was quiet for a long moment. Everyone in the courtroom waited to see what would happen next. Finally, he picked up his gavel. Ms. Jenkins, he said, looking directly at her, it appears I made a serious error in not hearing your full story. Not only am I dismissing the $500 fine, he paused, looking around the courtroom, but I believe I owe you an apology. Sarah stood straight, her face calm but her eyes showing relief. The people in the courtroom started whispering to each other. Nobody had ever heard Judge Richardson apologize to anyone before. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would change not just Sarah's case, the whole way the courthouse handled traffic violations involving emergency responders. After Judge Richardson's apology, the courtroom stayed quiet for a few moments. Then Sarah pulled out one more document from her leather bag. This one was different from the others. It was slightly worn, like it had been carried around for a long time. Your Honor, Sarah said, there's something else you should know. She handed the paper to the court officer. This is a letter of commendation from General David Martinez about a rescue mission I led in Afghanistan. The judge took the paper and started reading. His eyes widened as he went through each line. The letter described how Sarah had coordinated a dangerous rescue mission during a sandstorm, saving 15 soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah continued, her voice strong but humble. I spent most of my time in the Strategic Operations Center, but that day I had to go into the field. Sometimes, Your Honor, we have to break the usual rules to save lives. Judge Richardson put down the letter and looked at Sarah differently now. Gone was his earlier harsh attitude. Instead, there was respect in his eyes, and something else: shame. "The court would like to hear more about your service, Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice now genuinely interested, "and about your current work with veterans." Sarah nodded and stood a little straighter. "I work at the Veterans Support Center now, helping soldiers adjust to civilian life. We handle everything from job training to emergency mental health support, like what happened with Mr. Wilson." As she spoke, more people came into the courtroom. Word had spread through the courthouse about what was happening in Room 5, and now other court employees, lawyers, and even a few police officers were standing at the back, listening. "Last year alone," Sarah continued, "our emergency response team helped over 200 veterans in crisis. Sometimes that means driving fast, sometimes that means running red lights. We try to follow all traffic laws, but when a veteran calls us saying they're about to hurt themselves..." She paused, letting her words sink in. The judge nodded slowly. "How many veterans do you personally work with, Ms. Jenkins?" 57 right now, Your Honor. Each one has my personal cell phone number. They can call me any time, day or night." She pulled out her phone to show him. "Like these messages from last night." The court officer brought the phone to the judge. On the screen were text messages from different veterans, thanking Sarah for her help. One message read, "You saved my life last month. I don't know where I'd be without you." Judge Richardson read the messages, then looked around his courtroom. He noticed for the first time how many military veterans were there, watching and waiting. Some were wearing their service pins, others had military caps, and all of them were looking at Sarah with deep respect. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said, clearing his throat, "it seems I've made more than one mistake today. Not only did I fail to listen to your explanation, but I also failed to recognize a true hero standing in my courtroom." Sarah shook her head slightly. "I'm not a hero, Your Honor. I'm just doing my job, the same as I did in the Air Force, protecting people who need help." One of the veterans in the back of the courtroom spoke up. "She's being modest, Your Honor. Ask any vet in this city about Sarah Jenkins. She saved more lives here than she did in Afghanistan." The judge looked at his gavel, then at the $500 fine he had written down earlier. With a decisive movement, he picked up his pen and wrote something new on the paper. "Case dismissed," he announced firmly. "And Ms. Jenkins, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you next week. I think the court needs to develop new guidelines for emergency responders, especially those working with veterans." Sarah's face showed surprise. This was more than she had expected. The veterans in the courtroom started smiling, and a few even clapped quietly. But Judge Richardson wasn't finished. What he said next would start a chain of events that would change the entire court system's approach to veterans and emergency responders. The story of the traffic ticket that turned into a movement for change was just beginning. The next week, Sarah Jenkins arrived at the courthouse again. This time, she wasn't heading to the traffic court. Instead, she took the elevator to the 5th floor, where Judge Richardson's private office was located. The judge's secretary, Mrs. Thompson, greeted her with a warm smile. "They're all waiting for you in the conference room, Ms. Jenkins." She pointed to a large room where several people were sitting around a long table. Inside the conference room, Sarah found Judge Richardson, the city's chief of police, 3 other judges, and surprisingly, the mayor himself. They'd all stood up when she entered. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Jenkins," Judge Richardson said, his voice completely different from their first meeting. "After what happened last week, I did some research about your work. What I found was, well, remarkable." He picked up a folder and opened it. "You graduated from the Air Force Academy in 2009, top of your class. Then you served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where you received the Bronze Star for setting up an emergency response system that saved over 200 lives." Sarah sat quietly as the judge continued reading from her file. The mayor leaned forward, clearly interested. "But what really caught my attention," Judge Richardson said, "was what you did after leaving the Air Force. Instead of taking a high-paying job with a defense contractor, you chose to work with troubled veterans here in our city." Sarah finally spoke up. "Those veterans needed help, Your Honor. Many of them were struggling with PTSD, depression, and thoughts of suicide. They needed someone who understood what they were going through." The chief of police nodded. We've seen a big drop in veteran-related incidents since you started your program, Ms. Jenkins. Our officers tell me that whenever they find a veteran in trouble, they call you first. Tell us about your emergency response system, the mayor said, taking out a notebook. The one you mentioned during your court appearance. Sarah pulled out her phone. It's pretty simple, actually. Every veteran in our program has this app. She showed them a blue screen with a red button in the middle. If they're in crisis, they press the button. It immediately sends their location to our response team and alerts their assigned coordinator. Like what happened with Mr. Wilson? Judge Richardson asked. Exactly, Sarah replied. When he pressed that button on March 15th, I got his location and a message saying he was having suicidal thoughts. The app showed he was just 10 minutes away, but only if I took Main Street. The room grew quiet as everyone remembered the reason they were all there, a traffic ticket that had revealed something much more important. How many veterans have used this system? One of the other judges asked. Sarah pulled up some statistics on her phone. In the past year, we've had 312 emergency calls. Every single one of them got a response within 15 minutes. We haven't lost a single veteran who used the system. The mayor whistled softly. That's impressive, but it must be exhausting, being on call 24/7. Sarah smiled slightly. In Afghanistan, we work 24/7 to keep our soldiers alive. This isn't any different. These veterans are still soldiers to me, just fighting a different kind of battle. Judge Richardson stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city for a moment before turning back to the room. Ms. Jenkins, we've asked you here today because we want to make some changes. He looked at the other officials in the room. Your traffic ticket showed us a gap in our system. We have no guidelines for handling emergency responders who need to bend traffic rules to save lives. The chief of police nodded. We've already started training our officers about your program. They'll know to look for your emergency response vehicles. But we want to do more, the mayor added. We want to expand your program to other cities. Help more veterans. Save more lives. Sarah sat up straighter. This was bigger than anything she had expected when she walked into traffic court last week. The mayor's words meant her small program could grow into something that could help thousands of veterans. But first, they all needed to hear the full story of how her program started, and why she had chosen this path after leaving the Air Force. That story would change everything. Sarah took a deep breath before beginning her story. The conference room was completely silent as everyone waited to hear how her veterans program had started. It began with my friend Marcus, she said quietly. He was a young soldier in my unit in Afghanistan. Smart, brave, always smiling. But when he came home, she paused for a moment. He couldn't adjust to civilian life. The mayor and the judges leaned forward, listening carefully. Even Judge Richardson had sat back down, his eyes fixed on Sarah. One night, Marcus called me. He was driving around the city, confused and scared. He thought he was back in Afghanistan. Sarah's voice remained steady, but her hands tightened slightly on her phone. I tried to reach him, but by the time I found his location, it was too late. He had crashed his car. The room stayed silent. Judge Richardson removed his glasses and wiped them slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Marcus survived, Sarah continued. But that night showed me what was missing. Our veterans needed more than just phone numbers to call. They needed a real emergency response system, like what we had in combat zones. She opened her phone again and showed them more screens from her app. Every veteran in our program has a profile. It shows their service history, their triggers, their medication, and their preferred hospital. When they press that emergency button, we don't waste time asking questions. We just respond. The chief of police wrote something in his notebook, and that's why you sometimes have to break traffic rules. Sarah nodded. When a veteran is in crisis, minutes matter. Sometimes seconds matter. Just like in combat, we have to make split-second decisions. Judge Richardson stood up again, but this time he walked over to Sarah. Ms. Jenkins, I owe you more than just an apology for that traffic ticket. I need to apologize for something bigger. Everyone in the room looked at him with surprise. The judge rarely admitted mistakes, let alone apologized twice. For years, he continued, I've been treating traffic violations like simple black and white cases. Either someone broke the law, or they didn't. But your case showed me that real life isn't that simple. The other judges nodded in agreement. One of them spoke up, We've all been guilty of that, Michael. Maybe it's time for all of us to change how we look at these cases. The mayor pulled out some official-looking papers from his briefcase. That's exactly why we're here today. Ms. Jenkins, we want to make your program official. The City Council has approved funding to expand your emergency response system. Sarah's eyes widened. This was the opportunity she had been hoping for since starting her small program 3 years ago. We want to start by giving your response vehicles official emergency status, the chief of police added, like ambulances and fire trucks, and we want to train our officers to work with your team. Judge Richardson picked up where the chief left off, and in the courts, we're going to create new guidelines. Emergency responders working with veterans will have special consideration in traffic cases. But there's one condition, the mayor said, smiling slightly. We need you to lead this expanded program, Ms. Jenkins. Your experience, both in the military and with veterans, makes you the perfect person for this job. Sarah looked around the room at all these powerful city officials. Just a week ago, she had stood in traffic court, being treated like just another person breaking the law. Now, these same officials were offering her the chance to help veterans across the entire city. Before you answer, Judge Richardson said, "There's something else you should know." He nodded to his secretary, who opened the conference room door. Standing in the doorway was James Wilson, the veteran she had rushed to help on March 15th. Behind him were 5 other veterans from her program, all smiling, and behind them, filling the hallway, were dozens more veterans, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, but all there to support Sarah. James stepped forward. "We heard they were offering you a bigger job," he said. "We came to make sure you said yes." The story of how a simple traffic ticket led to this moment was about to become even more remarkable. But first, Sarah had to make a decision that would affect not just her life, but the lives of thousands of veterans. The sight of so many veterans standing in the hallway brought tears to several people's eyes in the conference room. Even the usually stern chief of police had to clear his throat a few times. James Wilson, the veteran Sarah had helped on March 15th, walked up to the conference table. He was carrying a large manila envelope. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was strong. "Before Sarah makes her decision," he said, "I'd like to share something with everyone." He opened the envelope and pulled out several handwritten letters. "These are from veterans in her program. We collected them over the past week." Judge Richardson gestured for James to continue. The mayor put down his papers, and everyone in the room turned to listen. "Dear city officials," James read from the first letter. "Last year, I was sitting in my car with a gun in my hand. I had lost all hope. Then I pressed Sarah's emergency button. She got to me in 8 minutes. She saved my life that night, and she's been saving it every day since." He picked up another letter. "I served 2 tours in Iraq. When I came home, nobody understood what I was going through. But Sarah did. She doesn't just run a program. She builds a family. Every veteran in her program knows they're not alone anymore." As James read more letters, Sarah sat quietly, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't known about these letters. She hadn't known her veterans were planning this. "And this," James said, pulling out one final letter, "is my letter about March 15th. He turned to face Judge Richardson directly. "The day Sarah got the traffic ticket, she was coming to save me. I had been having flashbacks all morning. Bad ones. I couldn't tell what was real anymore." The room was completely silent as James continued. "I pressed the emergency button at 2:47 p.m. Sarah arrived at 2:54 p.m. 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, she ran 1 red light and got a ticket, but in those same 7 minutes, she saved my life." The chief of police wrote something in his notebook, then passed it to Judge Richardson. The judge read it and nodded slowly. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said, standing up, "I'm not just dismissing your traffic ticket. I'm ordering all traffic courts in our jurisdiction to create new emergency response guidelines. We're calling it the Jenkins Protocol." Sarah looked up in surprise. "The Jenkins Protocol?" The mayor stepped in. "Yes, under these new guidelines, certified emergency responders working with veterans will have special consideration in traffic cases. Just like ambulances and fire trucks, your team will have the authority to break traffic rules when responding to life-threatening situations." One of the other judges spoke up. "And we want you to help write these guidelines, Ms. Jenkins. Your experience, both in the military and with veterans, makes you uniquely qualified. Sarah finally stood up. She looked at James, then at all the veterans standing in the hallway. Then she turned to face the city officials. "When I started this program," she said, "it was just me and a simple app I made on my laptop. I was working out of my apartment, using my own car, answering calls at all hours." She smiled slightly. "Now you're offering to make it official, to help it grow." "Not just grow," the mayor corrected. "We want to make it a model for other cities. The Jenkins protocol could help veterans across the country." Sarah walked to the doorway and looked at all the veterans who had come to support her. Some she had helped personally, others she had never met, but they were all part of the same family now. "On one condition," she said, turning back to the officials. "Every veteran in the program keeps their direct emergency button. No call centers, no automated systems. When they press that button, they get a real person who understands what they're going through." Judge Richardson smiled for the first time that day. "I think we can make that happen." The veterans in the hallway started clapping. The sound echoed through the courthouse, drawing more people to see what was happening. But this wasn't the end of the story. What happened next would change not just their city, but cities across the country. The traffic ticket that had started it all was about to become a symbol of something much bigger. 3 months after the famous traffic court case, Sarah Jenkins stood in front of City Hall. A large crowd had gathered for the official launch of the expanded Veterans Emergency Response Program. News cameras were everywhere, and reporters were setting up their equipment. The old traffic ticket that had started everything was now framed and hanging in Judge Richardson's office. Under it was a simple caption: "The day justice learned to listen." "Are you ready?" James Wilson asked Sarah. He was wearing a new uniform with the program's logo, a shield with a helping hand in the middle. As Sarah's deputy director, he had helped design everything from the new vehicles to the training programs. Sarah looked at the crowd. In the front row, she saw Judge Richardson sitting next to the mayor. Behind them were dozens of police officers, firefighters, and emergency workers who had all gone through the new Jenkins protocol training. "I'm ready," she said, walking to the podium. The mayor spoke first. 3 months ago, a traffic ticket changed our city. Today, we're showing the world what happened because one judge learned to look beyond the law to see the person standing before him." Judge Richardson stood up next. He looked different now, more approachable, less stern. "The Jenkins protocol has already been adopted by 12 other cities," he announced. "And today, we're launching something even bigger." Sarah stepped up to the microphone. Behind her, a large screen showed the new Emergency Response Center. It wasn't just an app anymore. Now it was a full system with trained responders, specially equipped vehicles, and coordination with all emergency services. "When I first started helping veterans," Sarah began, "I worked alone from my apartment. Today, we have 50 certified responders, all veterans themselves. Every one of them understands what it means to serve and what it means to come home." She pointed to the new response vehicles parked nearby. They were painted dark blue with reflective stripes, each one equipped with emergency lights and special gear for helping veterans in crisis. In the past 3 months, we've responded to over 200 emergency calls, not a single life lost. Every veteran who reached out for help got it, quickly, professionally, and from someone who understands their struggles. The chief of police stood up to share some numbers. Veteran-related emergencies are down 60% since the program expanded. Hospital visits are down 45%. And most importantly, we haven't lost a single veteran to suicide in our city since the program started. In the crowd, a small group of veterans stood together. They were from different wars, different branches of service, different backgrounds. But they all wore the same pin, a small blue shield showing they were part of Sarah's program. One of them, an older Vietnam veteran named Frank, raised his hand to speak. Sarah nodded to him. 3 weeks ago, Frank said, his voice shaking slightly, "I had a bad night, real bad. I pressed the emergency button at 2 a.m. Within 10 minutes, 2 responders were at my house. They stayed with me until morning. They probably saved my life that night." More veterans started standing up, each one sharing their story. Some had been helped by the program, others had become responders themselves. Each story showed how the program was changing lives. The mayor returned to the podium with a surprise announcement. "Today, we're not just celebrating our city's program. The state legislature has just approved funding to expand the Jenkins protocol statewide. And next month, Sarah will testify before Congress about making this a national program. The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah looked at Judge Richardson, who was smiling and clapping with everyone else. Who could have guessed that his harsh judgment in traffic court would lead to all this? But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As Sarah finished her speech, a special guest walked onto the stage, someone whose arrival would take the program in an unexpected new direction. The traffic ticket that had started as a simple case of running a red light had grown into something that would change thousands of lives. But first, everyone needed to hear what this surprise guest had to say. The surprise guest who walked onto the stage at City Hall was General David Martinez, the same officer who had written Sarah's commendation letter from Afghanistan. The crowd fell silent as he approached the podium. "I've been watching what Sarah Jenkins has built here," the general began. "What started with a traffic ticket has become something remarkable. Today, I'm here to announce that the Department of Defense wants to implement the Jenkins Protocol at every military base in the country." Sarah's eyes widened. She hadn't known about this. The general continued, pulling out an official-looking document. "Starting next month, every military base will have a Veterans Emergency Response Center. Every service member preparing to leave the military will get connected to a local response team before they take off their uniform." Judge Richardson, sitting in the front row, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. He remembered how close he had come to punishing Sarah for breaking a traffic rule while she was saving a life. "But there's more," General Martinez said. He turned to face Sarah directly. "Ms. Jenkins, the president has been briefed about your program. Tomorrow morning, you're invited to the White House to receive the Presidential Citizens Medal for your work with veterans." The crowd burst into applause. James Wilson and the other veterans rushed to hug Sarah, who stood in shock at this news. The mayor stepped up next to the general. "And here's our city's announcement," he said, holding up a set of keys. "We're converting the old community center into the new National Veterans Response Training Center. Sarah, these are your keys. You're going to help us train response teams from all over the country." Sarah finally found her voice. "When I was in that traffic court," she said, looking at Judge Richardson, "I thought I was just explaining why I ran a red light. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Judge Richardson stood up and walked to the podium. "Sometimes," he said, "justice needs to look beyond the law to see the truth. Ms. Jenkins taught me that. Now, every judge in our city asks questions first and makes judgments second." As if to prove his point, a group of judges from the city courthouse stood up. They were all wearing small blue pins matching the ones the veterans wore. "We changed how we handle cases involving veterans," one judge announced. "Thanks to the Jenkins Protocol, we now have veterans advocates in every courtroom. When a veteran appears before us, they don't face the system alone anymore." The chief of police added his own news. "Every police officer in our city has now completed the Jenkins Protocol training. They know how to recognize veterans in crisis and how to connect them with Sarah's response teams immediately." Sarah looked out at the crowd. She saw veterans young and old, some from her original program, others who had just joined. She saw police officers and judges who had changed how they worked. She saw emergency responders ready to help at a moment's notice. "A few months ago," she said, "I was just trying to help veterans in our city. Today, we're building something that will help veterans across the country. But remember, it's not about the programs or the protocols. It's about making sure that every veteran knows they're not alone." As she finished speaking, James Wilson stepped forward with one final surprise. He handed Sarah her old traffic ticket, now laminated and mounted on a plaque. Below it were the words, "Sometimes breaking the rules for the right reason can change the world." The story that began with a judge's harsh judgment had transformed into a nationwide movement. The traffic ticket that could have cost Sarah $500 had instead launched a program worth millions of dollars and countless saved lives. But more importantly, it had changed how people looked at justice, at veterans, and at the difference one person could make. As Sarah held up that framed ticket, the applause wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever chosen to do the right thing, even when it meant breaking the rules. The simple traffic violation that had brought Sarah Jenkins to court had become a symbol of hope for veterans across America. And this was just the beginning.